All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to my presentation on the tropical reefs of Yorkshire. This is going to be an investigation into what we call the Zechstein Sea. My name is Harry Loukes. I studied zoology at the University of Sheffield, and I did my master's degree in paleontology. And the research that I did is what I'm going to be showing to you all today. So I'm going to start this lecture with a question to you guys. What do we expect to find in a tropical reef? Any guesses? Yes. Yes, sharks, absolutely. Yeah. Starfish, yeah.
No rays.
Rays, absolutely.
Coral.
Coral, yep.
Coral.
Wow, you've got them all. I think you've got them all. Yeah, so we expect fish, we expect coral. Any other contributions?
Eel.
Eels, yes, we like those. So we expect a lot of things, we expect a lot of diversity. And as we move through this presentation, I want you to bear that in mind, your kind of idea of a current reef system. So, what are we going to be talking about today? So I'm going to start by introducing you to some of the paleogeography and the paleoclimate of Permian Yorkshire. The Permian was 250 million years ago, there or thereabouts. And I'm going to introduce you to the Zechstein Sea, where it is, what we're talking about, and then we're going to have a go at rebuilding some of the Zechstein's reefs ecology. Then we're going to go on to my area of research, which was, does the Zechstein match what our expectations and what you guys said of a tropical reef? How do we investigate this idea? And then we're going to look onto some of the explanations as to why the Zechstein is so unique and might not match the things that you guys just said. So, paleogeography. This is an image of Pangaea. This is the Earth 255 million years ago, and our sea happens just here in this red circle, just north of the central Pangaean Mountains, and on this little border right there is where the UK is. So we're talking about the UK a very long time ago, and this would have been where Yorkshire is, right on the coast of that sea. Some notes on the Permian. If any of you are aware of the Permian, you'll know that the biggest mass extinction to ever happen on Earth happened in this time period. And the Zechstein Sea, the sea that we're talking about today, did coexist with that mass extinction. In fact, it resulted in the loss of 90% of marine life on Earth. It's the biggest mass extinction the Earth's ever seen. And the Zechstein in particular lost 100% of its life. We know this because the sea dried up. So there's good fossil evidence to show that it was affected by this. But it's important to know that the analysis that we're going to do today and my area of research is all focused about 1 million years before the effects started to take place. So it's a little bit of context, but it's important to understand that this was a big end Permian event, but will not impact what we're doing today. Which leads us quite nicely onto the paleoclimate. 255 million years ago, the UK was a lot closer to the equator. So the conditions were warm, they were wet, they were tropical, much like a rainforest that you'd expect today. Yes?
And so we come back to this time climate now.
Because of global warming?
Yes.
Not this extreme. So we're getting hotter, but we're not getting this hot. We're talking about being in the Amazon rainforest, that kind of thing. So on land, we established rainforests, we established these wet, moist ecosystems. But what we're focusing on today is the sea that bordered these types of tropical ecosystems. So this is the Zechstein Sea. This graph on the left side displays where the Zechstein Sea would be in modern day Europe. You can see just here that it passes through Yorkshire. It starts as far up as Durham, cuts through Yorkshire and ends near where Nottingham is. And then expands as far east as Lithuania, Poland, that kind of areas of Europe. it's important to note that it's an inland sea. So it's connected to what we call the Boreal Ocean through the Norwegian Greenland Sea Rift. That is the stream of water you can see running down from the north of the diagram there. And this means that it's isolated from the rest of the ocean, the rest of the reef ecosystems of the Permian. Typically, this sea was very shallow. So you have a shallow sea combined with warm ecosystem, and that is perfect conditions for the formation of reefs. So that's what we expect to see. And this is what we do see. These are some of the main organisms that occurred in this reef. And as I tell you about these, I want you to think about how this compares to the organisms like the exciting sharks we mentioned earlier, how that kind of stacks up in your mind. So the bulk of the organisms, the bulk of the diversity and abundance was taken up by the bivalves. We know these today as clams, mussels, things like that. They would have just sat on the reef bed. We've got bryozoans. These are our reef-making organisms, similar to corals and sponges you have today. These are what would have provided the habitat and the sort of shape of the ecosystem. And then we get into some more obscure things. Brachiopods are clam-like organisms that attach themselves to the substrate and would kind of lean up into the water column, catch passing particles, similar to crinoids. Does anybody know what a sea lily is? Have you seen anything like that? It looks a bit like the live one on the right-hand side of that image there. No? Well, they're still alive today, but they're strange, typically not what you'd expect kind of organism. Gastropods, sea snails, sea slugs, things like that. And the arthropods are limited to one class called the ostracods. These are known as seed shrimp, very, very small shrimp that live in a sort of case. Now, this is probably not what you were expecting when I told you about tropical reefs. And we're starting to hone in on why the Zechstein is so unique and so interesting. There were some fish species, but only 19. And to put that into context, the Great Barrier Reef has 1,500 species of fish. And of course, the arthropods limited to one class. So, you can ask the question, what makes the Zechstein interesting? What makes it significant? It's because the reef systems did evolve, but despite the tropical conditions, despite the seemingly ideal situation for this explosion of life, a lot of the variety in the taxa is missing. And this is unusual, of course, because given tropical reefs tend to be hotspots for diversity. So this brings us on to what is most interesting about this sea. It's not what was there, it's what wasn't there. And some of the things up here you guys mentioned. The corals and sponges, you can count the number of species on one hand. I think there are about 3. Very unusual given that these guys existed at the time and that we associate them with reefs today. The cephalopods, you guys will probably know that things like ammonites and nautiloids are very typical in Permian systems, especially in reefs. These were almost completely missing. There was 1 species present. And the arthropods, like I mentioned earlier, are limited to 1 class, but we'd expect to see trilobites, we'd expect to see maybe crabs, things like that. They're all just missing. So, this led me to ask a biological question. And this is what I researched and what I'll be showing you today. Does the Zechstein display significant evidence of a lower diversity relative to another Permian shallow marine system? So, this is how I studied this. I did a comparative analysis of the signals of diversity in late Permian shallow marine ecosystem food webs. And that's a complicated way of saying I made some food webs and I looked at both of them and compared them. So until now, everything that we've spoken about has been observational data, which is good. We can get a lot of information from that. But in science, we like to have things to be testable and repeatable. We like numbers and comparisons. And until now, that doesn't exist for these systems. There's no quantitative evidence that actually suggests what I described to you as a very strange ecosystem is different from what we would expect. And that's what this study aims to change. But to do that, I needed another ecosystem, one to compare it to. The one I chose is the South China Block. This is another Permian shallow marine ecosystem. It existed at the same time. It existed close to the equator, the same as the Zechstein, and the paleoclimate and geography were the same. This is back to our map of the Pangaea, and this is where the South China Block existed at the same time. So once we have these two systems, I hypothesized that the Zechstein food webs I created would display signals of lower diversity relative to those of the South China Block. And that's the idea that I'm going to test. So to do this, I needed to generate massive data sets of all the animals that were living in both of these ecosystems. This was done in two ways. The first was curation of the University of Sheffield's collection. These were 100-year-old, well, hadn't been touched for 100 years, they're much older than that, but the old rocks that were shoved in the basement of the university, nobody wanted to touch them until they were dumped on my desk. I identified and categorized these to find out what was in them. And of course, that's a very small sample size, so I did quite an extensive literature review for both ecosystems. Many of the organisms that we're talking about here, the collections were done in the 1800s. So they're 200-year-old collections. A lot of them needed updating and reclassifying. And speaking of those collections, most of them were done by two men, Richard House and William King. Interestingly, William King is famous for naming Neanderthal, but we're talking about some of his work here that is a bit more rough around the edges, we could say. Now, problem with these two people is that they really didn't like one another, and I can show to you why that happened quite easily. In 1848, Richard House published a book titled this, A Catalogue of the Fossils of Permian Systems of the Counties Northumberland and Durham. Seems fine. But 2 days later, William King published this book, A Catalogue of the Organic Remains of the Permian Rocks of Northumberland and Durham. These guys really didn't like each other, and clearly there's been some plagiarism going on, and clearly they're not hiding it. In fact, Richard House disliked him so much that in his next book he dedicated 10 pages exclusively to William King and discrediting him, in which I think is quite fun, he wrote that King stole some of the materials from his collection and when confronted about them wrote a letter of reply that was too strongly worded to print. So they didn't get along, and the result of that is that they never worked together. These compendiums have never been checked, they've never been brought together until this study. So once I have a database that just simply lists all of the animals that lived there, we need to do some more analysis to get an idea of the lifestyles that these animals were living. This was done using by assigning functional trait data, and that data falls into the categories outlined by Bambach in his ecospace cube traits. Essentially, each animal is given a categorical life mode that fits into 3 categories. We describe their tiering, which is where they lived in the ecosystem. We describe their feeding habits, how they ate and what they ate, and we describe how they were able to move around the ecosystem. Once all of that's done, I also added a measure of size. We're talking about food webs, so it was plausible that a large animal could eat a small one, but not vice versa. So once that's done, this is an example of what one data point might look like. We have on the top here a bivalve that fed through suspension, can't really move around that well, lived on the surface and was quite small. This type of analysis, this type of assigning data was done for every fossil organism that we know of in both ecosystems. So once we have two massive data sets, we have to create a third. The third one outlines which organism life modes, I described the tiering, the feeding, the mobility, which types could feasibly eat which other types. This example here on the top says that a suspension feeding animal can eat the primary food source, and that a predatory feeding animal can feed on other predators, the suspension feeders, the deposit feeders, all of the things that you would expect a predator to feed on. So now we have three rather large sets. It's time to compare them. And I did this using a coding language that was written by these three men. That's Andrew Beckerman from the University of Sheffield, Jack Shaw from the Santa Fe Institute in America, and Dr. Alex Dunhill, who very kindly explained to me this code and works at the University of Leeds. So how the code works, quite simply, is it takes those three data sets, it takes the traits I've assigned to them, and it cross-compares them. So we compare what the animals had to what they could feasibly eat. And then it draws links between those animals that could feasibly eat one another. The result of doing this is a food web. So these are the two food webs generated, one for the Zechstein Sea on the left and one for the South China Block on the right. If any of you are familiar with food webs, you might know that the bottom is the basal food source. We're talking about plants there. This here is what we call the first trophic level. This would have been your animals that were feeding on the plants, your bivalves, your bryozoans, the things that we described at the start, the gastropods, that were all feeding on plant material. The intermediate trophic levels would have been things like small fish, the one nautiloid species, animals that are feeding on these guys, but also being predated upon. And at the top, of course, we have our predators, the sharks and the large fish. We can see already from just eyeballing these two, this one is much bigger. And that's what we were expecting to see. This is the South China Block. This is the typical Permian ecosystem that we'd expect. And this one seems to be missing some things. But the model goes a lot further, and it analyzes some quite intricate details about the system. These are numbers that I don't expect you to understand, but just understand that each point gives us some quite important information about the system. What we look for are these three things, and these are what I call the signals of diversity. We look for evidence of generalism and specialism. So generalist species would be those that are scavengers, they feed on multiple organisms, something like a vulture today. And specialists are those that are adapted to feed on just one or two organisms. Your very specialist predators that like a lion or something like that. Generalists are signals of low diversity. Specialists are signals of high diversity. We also look at the number of trophic levels, what I described earlier. So the more trophic levels, generally the more diverse the ecosystem. And for omnivory, which doesn't mean eating on plants and animals in this sense, it means feeding interactions that span more than one trophic level. And we also look for evidence of competition. So competition is a driver of diversity. In systems where there's high competition, we expect quite high diversity. And this is what we find. So I'm not going to bore you by explaining all of these. Essentially, we find no difference in the competition. There are more trophic levels in the South China Block. And the one value that's quite important here, and arguably the most significant finding here, is connectance. Connectance is a measure of the number of connections in the food web divided by the possible number of connections if everything was feeding on everything. What we see is that connectance is actually higher in the Zechstein Sea compared to the South China Block, despite the South China Block being a much larger ecosystem. This is quite strong evidence that there are high levels of generalism in the Zechstein Sea. And this is because generalists draw many connections through the food web, whereas specialists only draw one or two connections. So we draw some conclusions from this that we found significant evidence of generalism in the Zechstein Sea and that it's higher than in the South China Block. There's evidence of more complex trophic levels in the South China Block, which is indicative of greater diversity. There's no significant difference in the competition, so we can kind of exclude that. I also did a measure of species richness, so this is just the number of species I found divided by the area over which they're found. This is 3 times higher in the South China Block. And the result of this is that the study provides the first quantitative evidence of low diversity in the Zechstein Sea. So we've answered our original biological question, but that leads us on to maybe a more pressing question, which is why? Why is the Zechstein a strange place relative to the rest of the Permian? And why didn't the species we expect evolve? There are 3 theories as to why. The first is that the rift that I mentioned at the start of the lecture created what we call an evolutionary bottleneck. Perhaps not all the species that lived in the ocean were able to move into the sea because of a physical barrier, essentially. To test this, I did the same analysis that I described in the methodology section on the ecosystem that is north of the rift. And this is what we find. We actually find that this food web is even smaller than the Zechsteins. So, should the sea rift be causing an ecological bottleneck, we would expect a greater number of species in the Boreal Ocean, and then as we move into the Zechstein, we would expect that to be limited. But what we actually see is the opposite. The Boreal Ocean is quite small. This makes sense because it's an ocean ecosystem. It's typically, these are more like deserts than they are the tropical reefs. We move into the Zechstein Sea, which is a tropical reef, and we get what we expect, a radiation of life. But it's not really as large as we might have expected it to be. So we can essentially rule out that idea. The second idea is that there's an issue of preservation. Perhaps simply not all of the animals that went into the Zechstein were fossilized. And of course, the answer is yes, but no, not really. So there is a clear bias towards organisms with hard body parts in the Zechstein Sea. And the Zechstein preservation is typically poor. This is to do with pervasive dolomitization, crystal structures that form in the rocks as they fossilize, and they completely obliterate soft body detail. We typically only see shells, bones, things like that. However, this seems to be consistent across the 2 ecosystems. In fact, there is no soft body data points in any of the analysis. There are no sea slugs, for example, that were purely soft-bodied. So because this is consistent across the 2, it's not affecting the data. And if anything, it's actually masking the true diversity of South China more, because if it's a bigger ecosystem, we expect more soft-bodied. So if anything, it's drawing those 2 values closer together rather than pushing them apart. So we come on to the final idea, which is the cyclical regression and transgression in the Zechstein Sea. This is a fancy way of saying the sea level changed, it dropped, and then it filled back up again, and it dropped, and it filled back up again. And this happened 5 times over the course of its existence. Deposits show, as we move through the system, from the old rock layers to the newer rock layers, an increased amount of salt deposits. And as we get more salt, we start to get less fish. The salinity would have also been constantly changing. This would have affected fish because they need a constant salt level to survive. And this would have changed the deposition area of the rivers and estuaries going into the sea. This would have moved them closer to the reef beds and turned them into sort of sludge, inhospitable environments. And also the most obvious one is that the reefs dried out. So this process was happening once every million years or so. The reefs were drying out, they were getting flooded with mud, and then when it re-established and the sea came back in, we were at a different salinity level. And this acted to make the Zechstein a very inhospitable place, and I believe is the most likely explanation for why adaptive radiation was limited. This is just to illustrate the increasing salt deposits, a diagram that I very painstakingly made in PowerPoint. We start off here with some slate deposits, and as we move up through the cycles highlighted on the left side, we get increased salt, and as we get like evaporate formations, we get anhydrite, we get halite. These are all salt rocks. And as we move up, we see less fish. More salt, less fish. Starts to explain itself. So, to draw a conclusion to this, we found that the Zechstein Sea is a tropical reef anomaly. It's strange relative to the rest of the Permian. It displays significant evidence of stunted diversity. There is little evidence to suggest this is caused by the geology or the preservation, and instead it's likely a climate factor in that the sea level was constantly evaporating and constantly refilling, and this was just damaging the ecosystem. If any of you are interested, I have the references for this study, and any questions?
So it was just a big sea that dried out and filled up and dried out over millions of years.
Yeah,
And
roughly.
life just kind of declined because of that process.
Yeah, roughly once every million years or so, the sea would have dried a little bit, not all the way, a little bit, but all the reefs were exposed because, of course, they're in the shallow parts of the sea, and then filled back up again. But now life has to start again. A lot of the species were wiped out, and also we're at a new salinity level. So the fish that lived there now start to find it inhospitable.
So if that happened today, there'd be evidence would be of that the habitat around the area that dried out kind of changing into different areas like mangrove or brackish water.
Yeah.
But I suppose it's different flora in those areas.
Yeah, so my analysis didn't really take in the land stuff. The evidence of different land plants on there. I don't know how much it would have actually affected the land, but definitely the sea system was essentially becoming a new environment every time that it filled back up. Yeah.
Earlier you were talking about how the different you were contrasting both seas, and you mentioned how competition on both seas were relatively like the same, so it wasn't a factor. If it was a difference, how do you predict that it would have? How would you think it would have impact?
Well, what we would have looked for is if one of the systems had a higher competition level, the most likely would have been South China because there were more organisms. Competition drives the process of adapting. So if you're in high competition, I think it's the competitive niche exclusion principle, defines that you can't coexist with an animal that's competing for the same resource as you, at least not stably. Eventually one would die out and one would become adapted, better suited to the environment. So that's sort of a process that derives specialisms that we look for in the food web. If anything, we would have expected to see more competition in South China because there were more predators. Seems sort of intuitive, but that's not what we saw. There was essentially no difference. Yeah.
And does the lack of kind of branches in the food web from the top predators, is that the reason why it became 100% extinct? There wasn't the diversity of kind of macro.
Well, actually, the Zechstein, the one that did become 100% extinct, had more of the generalist species, and these are typical, like your survival taxa, the ones that you would expect to survive. The reason that they didn't is because it dried up completely. So these cycles of filling and evaporating, eventually they stopped, and that was maybe related to the end Permian mass extinction. Maybe it would have happened anyway. but we know that they all died out because essentially there was no water. Is that all?